on the phone J.P. Holding. Some of you call him James Patrick Holding. And he is involved with Tectonics. That's the website. That's the ministry. And has written several books and is really a prominent online apologist and has done a lot to answer some of the claims of the modern skeptical movement on the internet. And so I've appreciated your work, JP, and we are glad to have you on today. How you doing?
Great. How you doing? Glad to be with you guys.
What we are talking about today is Zoroastrianism. Now, here's what the deal is. I was talking to a friend recently, and they brought up someone saying, well, Christianity borrowed a lot of its stuff from Zoroastrianism. Now, you see this online in one version, which usually basically says Jesus is a ripoff of key aspects of this religion, and you actually dealt with this in one of your books, JP, Shattering the Christ Myth. Did Jesus not exist? On pages 212 and 213, 214, we're going to talk a little bit about that. There's also sort of a more scholarly version of the argument, which says during the sort of Persian reign in the ancient Near East, which is documented in the Old Testament, there were several key ideas that influenced Judaism and its theology, and which later on would sort of inform Christian theology. We'll see if we have time to get that one as well. I think we're going to deal with more of the sort of, less scholarly version, in my opinion, first. But, JP, where do you start? How does the claim usually function? Who says this claim? How do they say it? How does it work as a polemic against Christianity when you hear the Z word?
Well, let's start by speaking broadly of this as being part of a much larger set of claims involving other figures aside from Zoroaster. And there are at least one or two dozen other figures of which this type of claim is made, saying this figure was crucified, this figure was born of a virgin, this figure was baptized in a river. It's not just Zoroaster. In fact, the most popular of all is another Persian figure named Mithra. And he's the one I've gotten the most questions about historically, and the article I wrote on that is probably the most read of all the ones I've written about this. Now, again, Zoroaster, I haven't heard so much about him in a long time. I've never had a direct inquiry about him, but I'm assuming you have, and that you, from the sound of what you're saying there.
Yeah.
And so this is again, and this is being made by a certain select group of skeptics who are not always atheists; they're sometimes mystics, who are reading literature from usually the 19th century, where this sort of claim was made frequently by certain mystics of that era. And I'm thinking particularly of someone like Percy Graves, for example. He's considered very popular among that group. And then in the modern time, we have things like the Zeitgeist movie that are spreading this around.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up it's not always atheists. It's sometimes the sort of the mystical person that's saying, you know, look, you see the cosmic Christ spirit in all these figures, or some other version of that. Now, how do we begin to talk about it? There's all these different figures. What do people say about specifically Zoroastrianism? I mean, what's some background of it? How does this work? What's the point of their argument? You know, flesh it out, because, okay, so people are getting familiar with it, but how does this work? Why does it matter when a person utilizes? What are they trying to say? All right,
well, let's start with that first. What are they trying to do when they do claims like this? The main purpose seems to be to say Jesus is not original. These are ideas that have been had before. And as far as it can go, they will say the disciples or early Christians stole these ideas from the Zoroastrian literature or whatever literature and just applied all these things to Jesus. And perhaps to that extent, some will go so far as to say Jesus didn't even exist. The whole story was entirely made up, including his existence.
Fabricated almost like a mystical archetype.
And JP, you said there's one or two dozen like Zoroaster and Mithra. There's another 20 of them that this is being said about?
Yeah, I'd say that, on average that'd be about right. I mean, I've got my list right here. I can call that up briefly, but you've got Dionysus, you've got Tammuz, you've got Apollonius of Tyana, you've got Attis, Baal. You got a figure called Bedru of Japan, who is actually apparently another version of Buddha. I mean, I've just got, I'm counting my list here, at least 20, even Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican deity, if you can believe it.
They all lived between 500 and 2,000 years before Christ. Was that the time period of most of these people?
To some extent, yeah. In many cases, that's correct.
So the long and short of it is it's to make Jesus look like basically just any other figure out there, kind of a mythological, made-up person who that was a part behind a sort of type of mythic religion that we shouldn't trust in as a historical person.
Right, and so the argument is used to the effect of just ignore Jesus, he's no different than any of these others.
So, JP, what are some of the supposed parallels between Zoroaster and Jesus? What are they?
Well, I have a list of about a dozen here. Let me just read some of the main ones.
Sure.
Zoroaster was born of a virgin and by an immaculate conception by a ray of divine reason. He was baptized in a river. When he was young, he astounded wise men with his wisdom. He was tempted in the wilderness by the devil. He began his ministry at age 30. He was slain. His religion had a Eucharist. He was the Word made flesh. He had a sacred cup or grail, and he's predicted to have a second coming. And that's not all of them, but that's about, I think I listed 8 of them out of about the dozen I have right here in front of me.
Man, it sounds like Jesus is just like Zoroaster.
Yeah, that's the idea they want to give you, exactly.
So what do I do? How do I start tracking this down? What do I need to read? What do I do?
Well, here's the first difficulty with confronting this kind of claim. There are almost never sources given for things like this. I mean, they never will give a source from the original Zoroastrian scriptures. They will never link to a scholarly source. Or if they do give you a source, it will be someone just like them who is simply borrowing it from someone like Kersey Graves. Yeah. And it can be a real tempest trying to track down some of these things, especially when they make a claim like so-and-so was crucified. Well, then you have to go through books on so-and-so and try and find anything that said, obviously some of these scholars are not going to say, well, he wasn't crucified. You know, you're looking for a positive affirmation somewhere. And then if you don't find one, they might say, well, you can't find this, so maybe it's still true.
Yeah, needle in a haystack. So I mean, one thing is to ask the person, what's your source for that? I know where it says Jesus was crucified. What's your source that so-and-so was crucified? I mean,
Exactly. And more often than not, they can't produce anything other than these 19th century mystics I spoke of. And then I actually go back to some of the works of these 19th century people and look to see if they provide sources. And usually they don't. So what I ended up having to do with Zoroaster and these other figures is I simply had to find books by professional scholars on the subject of Zoroaster. And just a couple of the sources I used, for example, a fellow named Ernst Herzfeld, who wrote Zoroaster and His World, or Jenny Rose, The Image of Zoroaster. And these are all scholars.
And you had mentioned at the end of the last segment, JP, certain claims that some people have said about him, and therefore Jesus or the Christ of the Bible borrowed from him. Why don't you begin to dismantle some of those claims, if you would? You mentioned about 8.
Sure. Now, so what I should start with is more a general overview of how these claims usually end up being disproven, and this will apply to other figures as well. Well, the first way is you find that it's just simply not true what is claimed of this figure. A second thing you find is that it is true, but that the source that it's listed about this figure is much later than the time of Christianity. And this is especially relevant for Zoroaster because many of the claims about him come from Zoroastrian documents that are from well past the time of the Christian era.
So, yeah, you have some specific things about this on the website by you and another guy. Talk about briefly or in general or in detail some of the dates of the documents, because that's key. People got to understand you're making a claim that such and such influencer was ripped off when the documents are all post-Christian. Now, that's a problem for the claim. Explain that further, because that's big.
Okay. Let me just find a couple of examples here. Well, the Avesta, for example, is one of the chief documents. I'm looking for my thing that says the date here. About the 9th century A.D. is as late as this thing may have been added to. And of course, we don't have copies of these manuscripts of these documents from any earlier than a certain time. I'm just looking here about, like, say, 13th century for some of these. That was the last time I checked with one of these scholars. Maybe they found more since then, but there haven't been any revolutionary findings for any of these documents that put them into the pre-Christian era.
So it's difficult to assert that Christians borrowed from these documents if we don't have any certain evidence these documents existed. Now, the skeptic may say, well, they did it orally or word of mouth, or even though that's our latest copy, there's earlier copies the Christians could have looked at. But, they wouldn't let us do that kind of thing with the New Testament, of course.
That's precisely it. If the minute they pull that out, you've got them, because they give the New Testament no credence whatsoever. They don't give it any chance to do anything, but they might be willing to give the Zoroastrian documents all kinds of special treatment, like, well, maybe this goes back to way before Christian era, or the oral tradition. Well, yeah, okay, I'll take that, but then you've got to let me say that the oral tradition about Jesus was just as reliable. Oh, never mind. Let's skip that.
Right. So, you got some problems. And so people get a general idea. Zoroastrianism, from what we can gather, seems to have its key roots as far as where it really flourished in modern-day Iran, Persia. And the figure himself, Zoroaster, sometimes has different translations or pronunciations of the name in English, but seems to be a prophetic figure, and it's difficult to track down exactly what he taught and different things like that. And there's different aspects of the religion which we know were important, such as fire. Now, sometimes it's said that they're fire worshippers. That doesn't seem to be exactly true, but there was an importance to fire in the religion and things like that. That's some of the background. I don't know if you want to say anything else about the background, because people may say, I don't even know what you guys are saying.
Is this a religion? Is this a religion today?
Yes.
Is there a church of Zoroastrianism in Phoenix?
I don't know that answer, but I know the numbers are very small because they're big on being born into it, and then they've been killed a lot by Muslims in Iran. You add the ethnic aspect of they want you to kind of be born into it to really do it, to be a priest and all that, along with the persecution they've received, and they're radically shrunk.
JP, have you ever known anybody converting to this religion?
Well, I have not, but I did get an email from one of the people who was complaining because I was abbreviating Zoroaster's name in my article.
Oh, what should it be? Do you know the full big?
Well, I just did it for convenience sake.
You call him
Instead of
Zorro?
saying Zoroaster, I would put Z or Zorro. I was just wanting to make things as simple for people to read as possible, and they took grave offense to that.
Oh, wow. Well, that's interesting. I think the name is different. I think it's Parsi. They have a different name for it in the modern era.
So what is the dogma of the religion? What is the tenets?
Ethical, quasi monotheistic, probably more like dualistic or henotheistic system that I would say looks like some version of paganism, polytheism, and what we know of certain aspects of Judaism or Islam, something like that. I don't know. It's difficult to say exactly. Do you want to say something else that's probably not exactly right, but that's sort of right?
Well, the dualism has always looked to me a lot like David Eddings' Belgariad.
What's that mean?
That's a light fantasy series that I like to read.
Oh, okay.
It has a sort of dualism in it, but anyone who has read that series will know what I'm talking about.
There's sort of like a light god, a dark god kind of thing, and all of that. And there seem to be even other gods. Okay, but so what about? So we're talking about some general things, but some of these specific claims. Hey, what's the deal with the virgin birth?
Okay, now that's an example of the last general thing I wanted to give you for this, and so it'll be a perfect segue into explaining it.
Awesome.
A very common error here is what I like to call making a least common denominator association, and that's where they offer a description of two highly different things between Jesus and Zoroaster and collapse them down into a similar statement so that it sounds like they're very similar. Now, you take Zoroaster was born of a virgin. And the idea is they want you to think, oh, just like Jesus, okay? Well, we know the story of Jesus, and we know how that worked. Basically, the story is that Jesus was created like an act of divine fiat within the body of Mary, just like in the book of Genesis, all of creation was made. But when you look at the story of Zoroaster being born of a virgin, well, the Avesta, which is, again, a late source, but we'll allow them that for the moment, what you have here is a sort of kingly glory that resided in Zoroaster's mother for about 15 years.
That is a long pregnancy.
Right. Yeah, it's a long pregnancy. You might say that. And then this ray was an infusion of Zoroaster's spirit, not his body. And a secondary part of it is they said this was an immaculate conception by a ray of divine reason. Well, now, what's the immaculate conception? See, that's not referring to Jesus. That refers to the doctrine of Mary being born without original sin. So you see how they confuse something there?
Right.
I'm confused, so I guess I see that.
Well, that's what they want you. They want you to just simply associate these ideas with Christian ideas and assume a parallel. But the key thing they want to do when they cite these parallels is avoid the details as much as possible. Instead, they want to collapse them down into these vague summaries to make them both sound alike. And it's like referring to both a Rolls-Royce and a Yugo by saying, oh, see, they're both cars.
Huh. That's a good analogy.
Now, is the motive primarily to elevate Zoroastrianism or to de-elevate Jesus?
To de-elevate Jesus. I mean, these people they don't care about Zoroaster, and they will use the other figures, as I say, Mithra and Dionysus and all these others. And the main thing they're trying to do is what I call hurl the elephant. They're trying to throw all this information at you, which is almost impossible for the average person to check unless you want to go digging through some dusty shelves at your college library. And then they're just hoping to overwhelm people. That's what Zeitgeist was all about, too, these rapid-paced graphics and whatnot with all these claims one after the other.
Began to look at some specific things people say, and I think you made the great point of how the specifics aren't really being looked at here. It's sort of this big general. They're trying to strip it down to something very, very general, if we can put it that way, and make it look similar when in fact it's not. And I'd love for you to sort of continue that with maybe just another specific example that people will say, well, look, they're exactly the same. The story of Jesus is just like the story of Zoroaster. Another one that people will point to is Jesus being tempted in the wilderness by the devil. That same accounting is in the legend of Zoroaster. How would you answer that particular objection?
Now, it's true that Zoroaster was tempted by his devil of his system, okay? Of course, that's not the same Satan as we have in the New Testament. Now, according to the story of Zoroaster, he had about 10 years of visionary experiences, not 40 days, but 10 years. And then a lesser demon was sent by their devil, Ahriman, okay? Not the devil himself, not their devil figure himself. But this lesser demon was sent to deceive and overthrow Zoroaster. And the temptation presented to him was to renounce the good religion of Mazdaism and start worshiping evil spirits. There weren't any miracles suggested, like turning bread to stones or leaping from a tower or anything like that. Okay?
That's not a very good temptation. I mean, where's the temptation in that? Turning a stone into bread if you're hungry, it kind of makes sense. But hey, renounce your religion and worship cars.
Over here, yeah.
Renounce Mazdaism.
Now, the 30
just
thing
kidding.
is a little interesting too, because that's one that actually has an element of truth in it. Now, it does come from some very late Zoroastrian literature, so it's post-Christian. That's number one. But yes, Zoroaster did start his ministry at age 30. But here's the thing: everyone makes a big deal of the big 3-0, and that culture was no exception. The Jewish culture did, and so did the Iranian culture of that time. So that's an example of something that, although it's true, it's meaningless because it just reflects some sort of universal idea, in this case about turning 30.
Yeah. Now, in the life of Jesus, obviously prominent in the life of Jesus is him doing miracles, casting out demons, and other things like that. Some would suggest that Zoroaster was essentially doing the same thing.
Right. Now, that's another example of something that's really meaningless because, of course, if you believe in evil beings or demons, one of the things you're going to want the chief guy of your religion to do is start driving them out.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise he's not much use.
Yeah. That's his calling card.
There's some record of him healing a blind man, but that comes from a 10th century A.D. document. And he did that by dropping juice from a plant into the blind man's eyes.
Now, speaking of a plant, I don't know if that's the plant, but in Zoroastrianism, there's a very important sacred plant, and it's my understanding is it's a little bit confusing about what it is. Do you know what I'm referring to as far as this special plant in Zoroastrianism?
Yeah, I believe so. And I believe this comes into the parallel claiming that his religion had a Eucharist.
Oh, okay.
Now, the Zoroastrian scholars I consulted didn't seem to think there was such a thing. They probably did have communal meals, which is very common for ancient people to have of any kind. But in later Zoroastrianism, they had this rite with the Hyoma plant, I believe it is, Haoma.
Yeah.
And it's not clear whether or not Zoroaster actually knew about this or endorsed the ritual. But it's a daily rite of consumption. There's no connection between it and Zoroaster's body or blood.
Yeah, and it looks like they daily crush it or press it. And I guess modern-day Parsis, according to Edwin Yamauchi, substitute something called the ephedra plant for the original Hyoma. So, I mean, here's what's interesting. We're reading that, okay, so they got a plant in there, but how is that a Eucharist? See, here's the trick they do a lot of times, and I know you've talked about this. They take something that happens in the religion, and then they Christianize it with Christian terms to say, oh, look, a Eucharist. But that's not a Eucharist. That's not communion. They crush a sacred plant. That's what they're doing. Why Christianize it? Why try to baptize it unless you have deception as part of your motivation, I would ask.
Exactly. That's what I call the least common denominator association, by just collapsing down terms so that they sound the same in a summary way. I think the thing they do that most with is with resurrection. I mean, they call Osiris being put back together like a bunch of Lego blocks. They call that a resurrection. That's not a resurrection.
Right.
That's not properly defined a resurrection. That Michael Jackson coming out of the dead from Thriller. I mean, that's a resurrection too. Then.
So what do we say about some of this? Hey, ancient Persian religion influenced Judaism, so it influenced us. Now, briefly, let me set this in a context. There's an idea that's really not so popular anymore, or at least in academia, sometimes called the history of religion school. And the idea here is that, in essence, this is a boiled-down version. New ideas only happen once. We all know religion is merely man-made, and you have these innovations, and then they influence later religions. So if you see it first in one place, there must be influence, and let's find the influence. That's general what's going on. So some of this work or idea comes out of those ideas, this history of religion school. And so, of course, it's not that Judaism could actually be divinely revealed. It must be borrowing from other influences and maybe add its own spin here and there. But JP, comment, correction, what do you want to say about what we're talking about at this part of the show?
Well, every one of the examples given on that test would be one of those least common denominator kind of things I talked about. Okay, so they both had devils. I mean, who doesn't? I mean, over here the Mayans had evil beings, didn't they? And who did they get it from? Or did they send someone over here to steal it from the Zoroastrians or from the Egyptians or what? I mean, these are simple ideas that anyone can come up with just by daily experience, even if you don't want to talk about something being divinely revealed. And I think it's rather just insulting in a way to say, oh, they're not smart enough. They must have had to borrow it from somebody. That's the kind of thing that it's just disturbing to have that kind of thought out there, to just insult people's intelligence like that.
And logically, even if there is a parallel, like there's an actual real parallel, that doesn't actually prove borrowing. People got to understand that.
Not at all.
Even if you do have what looks like a parallel, it doesn't actually prove that one borrowed from the other.
No, and there's a lot of, even then there can be a lot of discussion about it. And one of the chief examples for Zoroastrianism, which actually I'm a little surprised wasn't on that test, has to do with the idea of resurrection.
Yeah.
Now, specifically, this is where you have to get in depth with some of the scholars on the subject, and you'll see a wide variety of opinions on this. Well, who borrowed resurrection? Who came up with it first? You have some scholars who said the Jews borrowed from the Zoroastrians. Then you got scholars who say the Zoroastrians borrowed from the Jews. But the most likely explanation, and one that does the least insult to people, is that they both came up with it independently because they both have similar beliefs about the unity of the body and the spirit. And so their assumption is body and spirit belong together as a unified whole, and therefore you're going to get both of them back at some point at the end times, as they might say.
Yeah, I have some things maybe I could read briefly from this book, Persia in the Bible.
Yes.
Page 461, and picking up in Yamauchi's books, here's what he says. The monographic study by Franz Koenig on the subject concludes that the earliest attestation of a Zoroastrian belief in a resurrection cannot be dated before the 4th century BC. And there's a footnote there. Furthermore, there are fundamental differences in how the Jews and the Persians conceived of the resurrection. This has been noted by many scholars, for example, by Robert H. Charles. Another footnote. The Jewish dead who are buried rise from the dust of the earth, whereas the Persian dead who are exposed must be recreated from the elements. Another footnote. In Zoroastrianism, the resurrection is linked with a fiery ordeal and renewal. Another footnote. Whereas in Judaism, the resurrection hope means life beyond the grave with Yahweh. Another footnote. Walther Edcrot therefore concludes, as these differences indicate the idea that the eschatological resurrection hope in the form attested in the Old Testament was influenced by Persian conceptions can be shown by any reasonably detailed comparison to be inadmissible. Another footnote. So, I mean, these ideas don't hold much weight. I hope you can see. Do you have a comment on that? Because I know you have this book. I saw it in your bibliography.
Yeah, I used it for some of my research. Well, there's two things. First of all, what the excuse will be is, they only borrowed parts of that. They naturally modified it for their own use. In other words, they conveniently borrowed just enough to find a parallel, but changed it enough so that it's foolish to think that maybe they didn't. And like I said, I surveyed the views of the various scholars. One of the more recent ones was Jan Brimmer, who wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Afterlife. And he wrote that in 2002, and he is definitely on the side of those saying that no one borrowed from anyone whatsoever. An example, he says, we should not presume that every Zoroastrian doctrine can be read back into the Zoroastrian Urzite. Zoroastrianism was a living religion subject to internal disputes and thus changed over the centuries.
Yeah, that's key. So even if some of the later documents that we do have about some of the doctrine have some of these beliefs, it doesn't therefore follow automatically that earlier versions of Zoroastrianism had this because of some of the malleability of the religion. People got to understand that. You can't just assume it's the same as it was before as an unbroken chain unless we have evidence from that period as well. Is that kind of what that's trying to say?
Yes. Yeah, you need a lot more evidence than they have to make the kind of conclusion that these borrowing theorists are talking about.
I want to be clear. When you mentioned, JP, that some of these writings were dated in the 10th century, 9th century, are you saying that they were written in that period of time or not discovered till that period of time?
The earliest manuscripts are from that time in some cases, and in other cases that's the earliest they were known to have been written, although there may be bits and pieces going back to earlier times.
So who's writing them then? What do we know about the authors of those manuscripts?
Well, virtually nothing.
Yeah. And what would their interest been in Zoroaster, who at this point was an ancient figure?
Well, they would have been continuing the tradition of following in the Zoroastrian religion. They were preserving their scriptures just like Christians and Jews would have been doing.
So does a modern adhere to Zoroaster, and I guess there's a larger church in Persia or Iran today, is that correct?
Well, they've been persecuted so long, there's hardly any left, is my understanding.
Would they say that we follow Zoroaster as opposed to Jesus or Buddha or Islam because he is the true God? I mean, again, what would their claim be?
Well, he'd be a prophet.
A prophet of whom?
The God of light within the religion. Is that right? I don't think they're from my understanding, though, they don't proselytize, which is another problem, another reason. Between the persecution, the whole being born into it makes you the pure version of it, and not proselytizing, their religion is almost nil. It's more just the historical, because it was influential when it was important. In fact, there's some evidence. Now, see, this can't be documented, but perhaps Darius the Mede and maybe some of the kings of Persia either had leanings towards this or were influenced by it, but it's so sketchy, it's difficult to really know. That's my understanding, JP. I don't know if you've looked much into that. Correct me where I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's not as much my topic, but I can tell you, while you've been talking, I've been looking up for any relevant websites. You got Zoroaster.com. It looks to be like a major site for them. Huh. And the chief god that he's a prophet of would be Ahura Mazda, which I hope I pronounced correctly. And it does sound like the brand of the car, but I assume that's not where it came from. Oh,
now that makes me wonder where that name did come from.
Yeah, they borrowed it from there. Yeah,
they did.
No, I'm kidding. I'm imitating the copycat theorists.
Oh yeah, right. Oh, I get it. Yeah,
it was covered.
Maybe Mazda never existed either. Okay, go ahead.
But you can still, like I said, I got that one email from someone, so there's still followers around. And that's not something I've researched too deeply, though, because my main concern was how they try to imitate Jesus. And it's not the Zoroastrians who are making this claim that I've seen.
Yeah, that's interesting in itself, too.
That's the idea. They only want you to they want you to see a tiny snapshot through the peephole. But when you open the door and see what's on the wall behind the peephole, suddenly things change.
Yeah, and this is a thing where one of the first atheists I ran into out on Mill Avenue, one of the college campus areas here in Phoenix, He said, well, Zoroastrianism, that religion is the founder of monotheism, and Judaism got the whole concept of monotheism from there. So you see this kind of stuff, but to do that kind of stuff, they have to just accept all these problems that with dating, and then they can't give the Old Testament the benefit of the doubt, or even just a reasonable look where they have to late date the Old Testament. They can't have it being written when it's claimed to be written to do this kind of stuff. And then they have to assume parallel means influence. They have to do all kinds of stuff that's just not scholarly or academic. It's not even good polemics, but it's easy to get over on people because it sounds fancy. And who knows about Zoroastrianism, you know?
Well, yeah, the more obscure it is, the better. But I'm sure you've asked the average person here, how many of you have read... if you ask one of these atheists, how many of you have read Jan Bremmer's book? Huh? They probably haven't even read Yamachi's book.
Yeah, they probably just heard it from a college professor. And there's even some interesting things about the way they would treat the bodies of the dead. They viewed it as being polluting the earth with the flesh if it went into the ground. And so what they do is they leave the dead out for exposure, and they have a tower where they put them up and they let the vultures eat all the flesh of them, and then they have these bone things where they dump all the bones.
Nice.
Imagine Jews doing anything like that. Not going to happen.